Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Homden, and I'm the Group Chief Executive of Coram. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this online event today as part of our Coram Society series. It provides opportunities to come together and explore Coram's past, present, and future. Today's theme has been chosen on Women of the Foundling Hospital Past and Present to reflect International's Women's Day and Women's History Month, which is March. And it's also timed to coincide with the publication of an article by our speaker, Dr. Kate Gibson, welcome Kate, in the April edition of History Today, which is out now in newsagents all across the country and available to you. And Kate is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Manchester, specialising in the history of fostering and adoption in Britain from 1700 to 1839. Now, I'd like to thank Kate for taking time away from her research to tell us about what she has found in the Coram Foundling Hospital archive and what it reveals about the women who were known as nurses. Today, we feel that we might more use the term of foster carers. And so this is one of the areas to explore today. Now, these women were paid to take foundlings into their home. Infants, of course, in the early origins, who were destitute, who had been presented to the care of the Foundling Hospital in the most extreme of circumstances. And the women would, and their families, would welcome and care for the infants until the age of around 4 or 5, when they would come to the Foundling Hospital School and Children's Home. So later on, we will be reflecting on this theme of caring and leading through the decades and centuries and into Coram's work today. And towards the end of the session, there will be an opportunity to explore any questions that you may have, and we will try to answer as many as we can. So please do use the Q&A function if you can, and I will try to cluster and select questions for the panelists. So first of all, I would like to welcome Carol Harris, who is Coram's social historian, to give us a short introduction to the fostering and inspection system set up by the governors of the Foundling Hospital, today known as Coram, and to talk about some of the women who took on the role of inspector. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everyone, and I'm just going to very briefly talk about the inspection system. Before I go any further, let's do the techie bit and sort that out, which is share screen. Now, I'm not sure if I can find the slides, and let's have a look. I'll start talking as I don't want to waste too much time. And then just, if we get the slides, that will be very nice. At the moment, I can't quite find them on my desktop. One of the radical aspects of the Foundling Hospital, right from the start, was the way that the foster mothers who took the children as wet nurses when they were brought to the Foundling Hospital, the way they were inspected. We would call today, this is safeguarding for children in the care system. There was nothing really like it at the time of the Foundling Hospital. The children were taken in as babies, and so the wet nurses were women who could breastfeed, and very respectable occupation for women at the time. They lived in the countryside, so they were away from the foul air of London. And after the babies were weaned, the wet nurses continued to look after them for the first few years. There were over 100 women who were inspecting the wet nurses locally, and many of them were just pretty ordinary women of the area, if you like. There were some who were titled and wealthy. A couple of them, if you go into our archives, that you'll find the names of Lady Betty Germain and her niece, who was Lady Vere. They're quite involved in a kind of advisory, all sorts of advisory capacities at first when the founding hospital was set up. But they are unusual as titled women who are involved in inspecting the foster mothers and see how the children are doing. They advised on all sorts of aspects of running of the hospital, and certainly Lady Betty was asked if she'd like to be the chief nurse, but she decided no, it was far too much work. I think it's also telling that at that time she was, I think, expecting or had just had her third child, and the two previous children had died. So I think she was otherwise occupied, as it were. To say, most of the women were not particularly wealthy. They included working class women who fostered children themselves, and some more middle class women. One of the really interesting ones, who's also someone we all know from the archives in terms of the setting up of the founding hospital, was Jane Hogarth. You'll know William Hogarth, many of you will know about William Hogarth's connection to the founding hospital and its establishment. He was a great friend of Thomas Coram, painted the famous portrait. And William and Jane were part of the inspection network. They were involved with the founding hospital, not just from the earliest days when Thomas Coram was trying to get the funds and the wherewithal for the Royal Charter, but for 35 years they carried on their association with the founding hospital as foster parents, but also inspecting the mothers locally. And they were part of the inspection network mainly in Chiswick, where if you go to Chiswick, you can visit the Hogarth house, where indeed they fostered the children and did their inspection. It was quite a detailed sort of method, and I think one of the things that really comes across from the Hogarths particularly is how it seems most of the household was involved in various ways with the founding hospital. For example, we have a wonderful thing in the archives that's a little receipt for stockings and shoes that one of the foster mothers in Chiswick has been reimbursed for, and the name on that receipt is actually Anne Hogarth, and Anne Hogarth has signed this as giving the money to the foster mother, but she's actually the niece of William, and she lived with Jane and William at the house in Chiswick with them. Another thing, if you go into our archives, that is so fascinating is to find the inspectors' reports. The inspectors are very, very diligent. They regularly provide inspection reports to the governors in London of what's going on locally. It's not just reimbursing the money that the foster mothers have been paid, and so you come across details in the inspections reports in the archives of all sorts of wonderful information. How many children, obviously, the foster mother has in her care, the lives and the circumstances of the people in the household. So what the husband does, how many natural children, what the weekly income is, all that kind of detail. The ages and occupations of all of those who are working in the house. It's how many rooms and the general condition of the environment. So it's very, very interesting detail for researchers like us. I'm just going to see if, just bear with me a second, and I've fiddled about and see if I can actually find my my slides here. Let's put these up and see if I can share the screen. No, it's not. Oh, there we go. bear with me a second. Right, excellent. So I'll quickly go through the images we have. That's Lady Betty, who I mentioned, wealthy enough to have her portrait painted. And this I'm sorry, it's a bit fuzzy, but this is the lovely image of Jane Hogarth, the wife of William, and the house in Chiswick where they lived for many years. And this is the receipt I was telling you about. And you can see, there we are, a year's nursing to Mary Woodley. And it has shoes, stockings, how much they've been reimbursed, and signed by Anne Hogarth. So that's rather a nice one. And here we have an example of the inspector's reports. And this one is actually, this is a fairly detailed section in the archives that goes into all the questions that are asked of the inspectors. And you can see it's the 7th question: what employment has your husband? And this is looking at a particular area. 47 farming and other labourers, 7 bricklayers, 4 carpenters, 3 sawyers, 2 wheelwrights, 2 tailors, etc., down to 79 foster families, homes that are inspected. And what wages do they have? And what employment have you? And if you were employed, what wages? Because some of the women were working in addition to being foster mothers. This lady, we know very little about the female inspectors generally. It's just typical for the time that they're, apart from the titled women like Lady Betty and Lady Vere, you don't come across much information about them. But one wonderful source that's actually not in our archives, but is available free as a download online, are the letters of the Foundling Hospital inspectors in Berkshire, edited by Gillian Clark, and all available as a free download. You can pick up the link if you want to afterwards. Caitlin will be posting it in the chat. So this particular lady is a rare exception of the usual situation where they're just names. This is Hannah at Aldworth, and she is one of the local women inspecting the foster mothers in Berkshire. And she was active from around 1759 to 1768. And it's a fairly isolated area, geographically speaking. So we get quite a lot of detail about it. It's a small group of inspectors who work under Dr. John Collett, who's a particularly active supporter of the Foundling Hospital at the time. Hannah was the daughter of a prosperous Newbury brewer who was also quite a philanthropist. And she has a sister, we think, who was also called Naomi Southby, who we think might also have been an inspector too. And you come across letters, for example, from Hannah to Mr. Collingwood, who was a secretary at the time, and she's saying, this is in the Foundling Hospital archive, and I've sent the account to you. I have 40 children under my care. At present, they're all pretty well. I will have drawn upon you £8, 5 shillings and 4pence, payable to Mr. Richard King or his order. There's a lot of money circulating around. These are women who are sort of getting quite considerable sums to dole out to the foster mothers from time to time. Another thing that comes up in Hannah's archive, Hannah's letters, is there's a fantastic list in the Berkshire archives of all the medicines she's reimbursed the foster mothers for. And it's a wonderful guide to, I mean, most of them completely useless, unfortunately, but the various kind of herbal and sort of natural treatments that we used for various illnesses at the time. It's very, they write a lot. They talk about, for example, I wrote to Mr. Child last week. He sent me a letter Sunday and said he'd had no letter from you, which makes me think Mrs. Lester never opened the dead bundle it was put in. A dead bundle was when a child died, the clothes the child had were bundled up and sent back to the Foundling Hospital often, and that was called the dead bundle. So lovely, lovely detail for researchers in those sorts of sources. I'm running out of time, so I'll quickly get on to another one who's absolutely important, vital person in the story of the female inspectors. This is, it's actually from about 120 years ago, a photograph of Hadley Common, which is in Barnet. It was the location, although the building is long gone when this photo was taken, of the Barnet Foundling Hospital, which was the smallest of the 6 branch hospitals set up at the time, or just after, in this case, the period of general reception, when all the children brought to the Foundling Hospital's doors were taken in by the Foundling Hospital. It was opened in 1762, so 2 years after Parliament had decided to end the funding for the general reception period. Simply, it became too expensive and the hospital was overwhelmed by the numbers of children. But a local woman in Barnet, Prudence West, who had been a foster mother herself, actually lobbied successfully for the hospital, a branch hospital, to be opened in Barnet for the foundlings, because although the period of general reception had ended, they weren't taking any more children in. Of course, the children who had been taken in were with their foster mothers until the age of 5, and then by rights ought to have gone to the London institution, the building in Bloomsbury. But Mrs. West was she lobbied for this, the Barnet Hospital to be built to take in the children locally. And it was the only hospital not to be run by a board of male governors. More than 200 children were cared for in the local area over 5 years by nurses supervised by Mrs. West. She was well respected by the London governors for her high standard of care and supervision of the local nurses. And it was really, for good or ill, Mrs. West, they as a result, they sent her the weakest and sickliest of the children to look after, because of the clean, fresh air, and that she would be able to make sure some of them, more of them, survived, they thought. So I'm going to have to close now. So I think there's so much to look at if you're interested in this in the archives at London Metropolitan Archives. So much of interest that tells us about just general life and times of women in the periods, the 1700s and 1800s in the Foundling Hospital. And also, so have a good read of the Berkshire letters online as well. They're absolutely fascinating documents, and they do show that, as I said at the beginning, the level of inspection and care that was given to the children through the system the Foundling Hospital governors set up was really, really quite exceptional. Okay, thanks very much. Stop.
Thank you very much, Carol. So I'm so glad that you were able to find the slides, because the fascinating imagery and little dockets and receipts are a wealth of information. So it's my pleasure now. We're going to go straight on rather than opening up questions in between. So Carol will be on mute and off screen with me also, whilst we give the starring light to Kate Gibson and to hear all about her fascinating new research. So Kate, well done, in full command of your slides, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol, for, well, both Carols, but thank you, Carol Harris, for giving us that overview of the inspectors, and thank you everyone at Coram for having me today. Just a warning for everybody that I will be discussing infant illness, distress and death in my presentation. So when the London Foundling Hospital opened in 1741, a central concern was how to provide wet and dry nursing care for the children it admitted. From the beginning, it relied on a network of nurses in towns and villages across the country to ensure a plentiful supply of milk, care and fresh air for the foundlings, away from London pollution and infectious diseases. Babies left at the hospital were assessed, and those deemed well enough to travel were immediately sent out to nurse. Nurses brought up the children until they were between 3 and 5 years old, when they were sent back to the hospitals in London or the branch hospitals in Ackworth or Shrewsbury. When they reached around 10, they were either apprenticed or found work. The governor's main aim was to keep children alive. So this was out of a humanitarian desire to save the vulnerable, but it was also because they saw them as future workers, the soldiers, sailors, and manufacturing workers who would fight wars, expand the empire, and build national prosperity. So the governors, therefore, saw the relationship between nurses and children as primarily a commercial one. Physical care in exchange for money, and they did not really, at first at least, think much about the emotional impact of separation on either the child or their foster family. So how does the founding hospital fit into a larger story about women's history? Firstly, wet and dry nursing were fairly common occupations for women, and they're so common that they actually appear in a lot of European art, like this picture here from 1788. All the major European founding hospitals like Lisbon, Paris, and Amsterdam sent children out to live with nurses. It also wasn't unusual for private families to use nurses, particularly if a biological mother couldn't breastfeed due to ill health. So although nursing wasn't unique to the London Foundling Hospital, they did have an unusually large, well-organised and efficient system that kept track of children whilst at nurse and throughout their lives, and they're tracked in these nursing books. And we also have thousands of letters written by inspectors and occasionally by nurses themselves detailing the care given to the children. The Foundling Hospital Archive is really amazing, actually, in giving us access to the lives of hundreds of ordinary working class women who don't often appear in other sources. It also provides a unique archive of care work, which historically and now has primarily been done by women and was therefore overlooked in the historical record. But thanks to work by historians like Alyssa Levine, Valerie Fildes, Ruth McClure, and Gillian Clark, whose books are all very worth looking at if you are interested, we know considerable amounts about the characteristics of nurses. So they were drawn from across the rural labouring class. They were usually married with their own children, and their husbands had a variety of occupations, from agricultural labourers to shoemakers and tailors. They were drawn primarily from the home counties, near-ish London, so Surrey, Middlesex, Essex, Hertfordshire, Berkshire, Hampshire and Kent, and smaller numbers from Yorkshire and Derbyshire. And in general, the nursing system was broadly successful. Mortality rates were good in comparison with other European foundling hospitals. Many nurses were diligent in their care, and most inspectors carefully monitored children's welfare, reported any incidents of abuse, and removed children from nurses suspected of neglect. Inspectors were not afraid to remove children, and on the whole, it seems that abuse and neglect were unusual. So this is a fairly typical inspector's letter from Mrs. Banks of Ewell in Surrey, informing the hospital of the death of foundling Judith Crowe, number 15,141, quote, that unhappy child who had her leg broke after being ill-used by her nurse. So although Mrs. Banks moved Judith to another nurse, her new carer wasn't able to save her. So what made a woman want to be a nurse? Wet nursing was a desirable profession. Although at its height, the hospital had over 5,000 children out at nurse, so that's at once, 5,000 children at once, it never ran out of nurses. And this was partly because they were well paid. The hospital paid 2 shillings and 6pence per week for each child, and that's the equivalent of a day's wages for a skilled tradesman. Most women fostered 2 children at once, doubling their income, and the hospital also paid a 10-shilling bonus if a child lived to be a year old. The majority of women were married, and so they would have had some income from their husband's wage, but 2 shillings and 6pence a week would have been a major part of their household income. Nursing was also work that could fit around women's other caring responsibilities and employment. Most of the nurses had young families of their own, so that's on average 4 children when they first took in a foundling. So the foundling was coming into a household that was already very busy with small children. Wet nurses had to have recently given birth to their own child, so they would have milk in the first place. So they took on a foundling where their child was about to be weaned, or in some cases after their own child had died. Nurse Susanna Bolson of Swakely, which is on the Middlesex-Buckinghamshire border, and you can see the letter here, asked for a fanning while she was still lying in after giving birth to her second child. Her inspector commented, and I'm quoting, "She is particularly fitted for a wet nurse by her own child's being dead." Susanna already had 2 foundlings with her, Mary Richards and James May, by whom her inspector stated she has done great justice. Mary and James were being raised alongside Susanna's biological son, John, who was then 2.5. Susanna's husband was a labourer, and so the nursing income would have been very helpful. Many women will have reasoned that if they were going to be at home looking after their own children anyway, they might as well take another child and be paid for it. 2 foundlings were even more efficient, as Inspector Nathaniel Edwards of Weybridge stated of his nurses, and I'm quoting, "Those that have only 1 child are desirous of having another, and say that they can do better in going out to work than staying at home to nurse 1 child." Nursing also seemed to have been particularly popular because it could be combined with other paid work, especially seasonal agricultural work. Several of the inspectors talk about the difficulty of getting nurses to travel to the hospital to pick up or drop off children during harvest season. Women would get elderly relatives or older children to mind foundlings while they gathered crops, and this was a very common practice that women did with their own biological children as well. In August 1759, for example, Inspector Henry Nichol of Barsham in East Anglia stated that he would find some trouble to get a woman to bring foundling Isaac Foster back to the hospital, as harvest and hopping, so he means harvest and hopping, is near at hand. Inspector Roger Kynaston of Shrewsbury stated that it would be difficult to send nurses to the hospital at short notice, as the better sort and those that are fittest to be entrusted with the care of children have either cows or families to manage and cannot be spared from home. So it's agricultural. These women are in agricultural places. In 18th century England, most work available to women was temporary and poorly paid. The economy was unstable and many households lived off precarious earnings. Men could find themselves suddenly out of work, and food prices could fluctuate in times of harvest failure or war. Nursing foundlings was therefore a very stable occupation, and many of the women were savvy budgeters who could work out the most lucrative option for their labour, whether that was nursing or bringing in the harvest. There were some major disadvantages to nursing, the main one being a risk to the health of the nurse and her family. Many of the infants were in very poor health when they were admitted to the hospital, and while waiting to be sent to the country, they were also exposed to diseases in the hospital itself. Nursing was a very intimate occupation. As well as the bodily closeness of breastfeeding, foundlings often slept in the same beds as their foster parents or foster siblings and shared the same blankets. Several nurses complained that their foster child had brought diseases into their home, ranging from scabies, which they call the itch, to smallpox and syphilis, which could be passed through breastfeeding. And in recognition of this increased occupational risk, the hospital actually paid for the treatment and expenses of a nurse and her family while she was being cured. But it does put some women off, particularly if there's like a smallpox outbreak or something like that. There's also lots of evidence that nursing was seen as a skilled profession that was worthy of good pay. In order to become a nurse, women had to provide a recommendation for character from the church wardens or clergy of their parish. So you can see one of these recommendation forms. Inspectors often described women as being careful, clean, and healthy, and often cited either their experience in bringing up their own children or working as a private wet nurse to other families in the neighbourhood. Anne Sitch of Stondon, aged 26, was a very clean, industrious woman, while Martha Simnel of Epping Forest was a very careful body who has brought up 3 children who are now with her in a very thriving way. Some of the women could be described as career nurses. Nurse Ely of Shrewsbury, for example, was described as a nurse of established credit, having suckled the children of several good families of their neighbourhood. Inspectors regularly picked specific nurses to care for children with disabilities or poor health. Apothecary and Inspector John Heaviside recommended Nurse Mary Piper to take 2 unwell children, as she was particularly careful and understanding in all the disorders of children, and one whom I can safely rely on. When trying to think of what was best for one poorly child, Inspector Mrs. Clark consulted Lucy Osborne, the nurse I would recommend, as I have a great opinion of her tenderness. Inspectors often rewarded nurses with extra payments for nursing a child through a particularly severe illness. In September 1759, the nurses of Barkham in Berkshire were given a bonus after an outbreak of measles in recognition for what the inspector called their extraordinary trouble. Care in these circumstances was seen as difficult, physically demanding work, and as such worthy of financial recognition. The standard practice of paying a 10-shilling bonus if a foundling lived to be a year old could be construed as callous, but it does reflect a recognition of the effort and skill involved in getting children through the most dangerous period of their lives. So the nurses were all working class, and so they were at a disadvantage to the middle and upper class inspectors and governors. However, many of the letters indicate the nurses were not afraid to complain about poor pay or working conditions, and that they worked together to share information about pay and to bargain for improved conditions. And in many cases, this involved bypassing the inspectors and writing directly to the hospital governors. In 1759, nurse Sarah Hill complained to the governors about her inspector, John Atkinson of Hatfield. She accused him of subcontracting his inspectorship to a Mr. Dunn, who was reportedly forcing the nurses to spend their wages in his grocer's shop. And this was against hospital rules. John Atkinson denied the allegations in a way that traded on Sarah's lower position as a working class woman. He wrote to the governors, "I was much surprised at the insolence of Sarah Hill." He said Sarah had broken the rules by refusing to bring her foundling for inspection, and he had threatened to remove it from her, on which he said she was very impertinent and would not bring it. Interestingly, the governors were interested only if Sarah was taking care of her foundling properly, and so told John that they had decided to recommend to Mr. Atkinson not to remove the child if she takes care of it, and to order her pay in money. Sarah had defended herself by bypassing Atkinson's authority entirely and appealing to the governors, and she had actually brought her foundling, Sarah Rich, more than 20 miles to the hospital in London to prove that she was caring for her properly. So she completely bypasses Atkinson's authority. Our image of 18th century society is often very hierarchical, with working class women being really at the bottom of the heap, but this might just be because the evidence of them standing up for themselves hasn't survived. The Foundling Hospital archive shows that women were able to defend themselves against middle-class men, partly, as in Sarah Hill's case, by being very knowledgeable about their rights and the rules of the organisation that they worked for. In October 1759, some nurses from Twyford in Berkshire campaigned for a 10-shilling bonus for caring for foundlings who had been abused or neglected by their first nurse. So this is for an extra payment that's not in the rules. So the nurse isn't openly used in the rules. The nurses based this on their reading of a much earlier printed form of rules that the hospital had given them 3 years earlier. Their inspector, Theophilus Hughes, stated that, "My nurses will none of them take less than the whole reward, but insist on the whole from me, and I am in honour bound to pay them, being fully persuaded that they would not have taken them were it not in expectation of the reward, there being much more care and trouble to be bestowed on abused children than ordinary." The nurses knew the value of their care, and as Hughes states that all of them refused to take less than 10 shillings, I think this means that they worked together to get what they felt they were owed. Some inspectors were worried about the power that groups of nurses could wield if they clubbed together. Inspector J. Brecknock worried about, and I'm quoting here, "my nurses rebelling," which is great language, after one of them, Mrs. Marshall, applied to a different inspector after Brecknock refused to give her a second foundling. Brecknock told the governors that he felt he had to take a stand and remove her first foundling, as, "If I do not remove my child from her, the rest of my nurses that way will not fear what I say." This insubordination, he reasoned, would be bad for the foundling's care. He said, "If I suffer my nurses to disobey my orders, I'm sure the children will soon be the sufferers." So throughout the archive, you have this language of rights from nurses and of entitlement to pay and bonuses for their care work for a job that they thought was well done, balanced against the inspectors trying to control a large number of working class women. So far, the picture that I've painted of the nursing system might suggest that it was heavily mercenary, with nurses primarily interested in pay and working rights. There is, though, and I think unsurprisingly, evidence that nurses combined financial pragmatism with considerable love for the child under their care. Many inspectors talk about the emotional side of care, using words like tenderness to describe nurses' work, or describing a nurse's distress when a foundling died. There is also evidence of the emotional impact when nurses were separated from their foundlings when they reached between 3 and 5 years old. At this point, the hospital sent what they called caravans or covered wagons, staffed by hospital workers, to take the children from their nurses and bring them back to the hospital. In theory, nurses would smoothly give the older children up, be given an infant to replace them, and not have any further contact with the child once they have gone back to the hospital. In reality, though, the process was much more complicated and distressing for both nurse and child. Inspectors Joseph and Anne Bailey complained that the hospital was recalling children in an unnecessarily cruel manner, basically without giving them advance warning. So they say, taking the founding children from the nurses without a notice or giving them any warning, and heart broke all the nurses almost. It would be made a heart of stone to melt to hear the cries and cries that there was with the poor infants. In September 1759, a caravan sent to Ashbourne in Derbyshire reported that some nurses had refused to give their children up. The hospital refused to pay the nurses their wages until they had surrendered the children, and wrote a menacing letter threatening such nurses with the vengeance of the hospital who would not deliver the children. They eventually only got the nurses to comply by getting a justice's warrant from the magistrates. The husband of one nurse, a Mr. Ditch, pretended to give his foundling up, and the inspector says he afterwards stole him away. The reason he gave was that his wife was at her down lying, so that means about to give birth, and that it would be the death of her if the child should then be taken from her. Many inspectors reported similar difficulty in removing children from foster parents who had come to treat them as their own. Thomas Marsham of Reading felt that taking them away has been a very hard and difficult task. They being there so long has naturalised the children, so I could not have got them. And I have every day more trouble with those women to send for their children, as they call them. At present, they say I have robbed them of their children. When the hospital governors had first set up the nursing system, they did not intend foundlings to have long-term relationships with their foster families. Adoption was not a legal concept in this period, and so there wasn't an established route to recognise the love that could develop between a foster parent and foundling child. But the inspectors record many requests from nurses for something like adoption, with nurses asking to keep children under any terms and without pay. In response, the hospital began allowing nurses and their husbands to apprentice the foundlings. Apprenticeship was as close to adoption as they could get, as it provided both the foster parents and the child with a legally recognised relationship. Foster parents as apprentice masters or mistresses were then legally obliged to provide education, food, lodging, and other quasi-parental responsibilities. And it's in these requests to keep children that we get the fullest sense of the bonds that could form between foster families and the children they care for. And I can say a bit more about this in the Q&A if you want. So in conclusion, many of the nurses viewed their care as a skilled job that could help support them and their families. They knew the value of their care, and they were in general not afraid to work together to get what they felt they were owed. However, they also understood that care work involved emotional labour too, what the inspectors describe as that all-important tenderness in caring for a sick or vulnerable child. In many cases, this blossomed into close, loving, personal relationships. And I want to leave you with a transcript of one of the few long letters that we have in the archive that's actually written by a nurse, rather than about a nurse, by an inspector. So Elizabeth Grout of Wokingham appealed directly to the committee. She bypassed her inspector, asking to keep a foundling, James Creed. She asked to keep him upon any terms so that I might not part with him, as he is to me as though he had been my own natural born son, and my love and affections to him is so great that to part with him will be as to part with my life. For my love to him is so great that to part with him will almost, if not quite, bereave me of my senses. And I think, I need to follow up, but I think I was in the archives today, I think she did get to keep him, which is the happy ending, at least. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kate. Absolutely fascinating insights into the rights and workforce of women in the community, as well as around the Foundling Hospital, and the pioneering work that was done. And what we have to remember is that, as Kate has reminded us, there was no legal form of adoption, in fact, not until 1926. The alternative to the Foundling Hospital was the workhouse, and that the work that was done was really establishing the basis of a care profession, which we would now describe as foster care. So I thought it might be interesting just to reflect on two further things. One being, what is the contemporary picture around care, alternative care? And the second is the role of women as it continued within the Foundling Hospital workforce. So to take the first area, what is the state of care today? Well, it was 1948 and the passing of key legislation with the formation, obviously, of the welfare state that first laid the duties that we now would recognise as the care system on local authorities, and our colleagues in the children's services sector play an absolutely vital and indeed internationally recognised role in child protection and support to vulnerable children. Currently, there are something in the region of 45,000 fostering households and something just under 80,000 carers. There's been an increase in fostering households since 2015 of about 4%. But during that period, the number of children needing the support of the care system has increased by around 11%. And we now have the largest number of children in care in England ever recorded. Within that, we have around a third, 27%, I think, who are actually caring in foster care placements for the children of family and friends, and the majority, however, being forms of alternative care. There were something in the region of 160,000 inquiries for people interested in coming forwards to be foster carers. I see that as an enormous propensity to care and compassion in our society. However, of course, it is a very difficult thing to do, as we have noted from today. And it is in 2020-21 that figure was, and the 160,000 actually converted into 6,000 applications, about a third of whom were approved. So as things stand, we do not have a sufficient number of carers or sufficient diversity, and the workforce of carers, if you could call it that, the compassion of care that surrounds children and provides such stability and love to so many, is actually aging. And therefore, a key challenge for the care system is how to ensure that we have sufficient available placements for the children who need them. And what do the children say about the care they receive? When we are reflecting upon the history of the Foundling Hospital, we have to recall and remember that in those eras, children were lucky if they were seen, let alone heard. One of the great advents of the modern care system and of the advent of rights has been the importance of voice and of hearing the views and experiences of children and young people. And Coram is at the forefront of this work through the evaluation of subjective well-being, i.e., what do the children think is important to them, which is not necessarily what professionals think. Children rarely say to me, I'm really bothered about whether I've got my GCSE results when I'm 16. What they talk about is, do they feel safe? Do they feel loved? Do they have friends? Can they have a pet? All of these things that make them feel normal and belonging. A third of children in the current care system do not know why they're in care. And we know what that can do to the future development of identity. All too many children have a significant number of placement moves. 20% of children think that they have too much contact with their family of origin or with the wrong people. And another 20% think they have too much contact or with the wrong people. So these issues of relationship and identity, affection and continuity continue to be at the heart of the system. 83% of children surveyed in the most systematic surveys ever conducted, including those under 7, 83% talk about the fact that their life is very much better than before their care experience, and that they can depend upon having an adult that they can trust. A higher number, by the way, a higher proportion than in the general population. But for those children who enter care late, those children who have multiple moves of placement, the outcomes can be poor. And in finding placements for children, those issues of concern of the Foundling Hospital to be so careful around the physical health, so critical of the time, but also of the issues of disability, have remained throughout our work. The worst outcomes for children and young people leaving care are those with long-term health conditions and disabilities. A scandal, really, in our contemporary world, given how much is known about them. And for foster carers, it is, of course, not the fostering of infants that is the job alone. It is the fostering of children throughout their entire childhood, and the largest increases in those in need of foster care support are currently with unaccompanied children and young people. So the issues are eternal ones, and the workforce remains largely female. So if we turn to the question of what is our care profession and how does the workforce of Coram and other organisations reflect this? Well, within the social work community, 80% of social workers for children are women. So the 80-20 is reflected in Coram also. But of course, over the decades, over the centuries, a year on from women's suffrage, the balance in women in authority, those who are defining the rules, not just being subject to the rules, has changed fundamentally, and no more so than in our own organisation. So it is just 100 years since this organisation, the first and longest continuing children's charity, welcomed Eleanor Barnes and Lady Evelyn Wachter as our first women governors. Yes, it took that long from the origins, but also relatively early in a system that still does not reflect fully equality and diversity in governance. It was in 1954 when the organisation stepped away from residential care, and a system that had remained largely unchanged throughout the Industrial Revolution until the First World War. It was still engaged in fostering. So there were still children and young people who needed that fostering support. And the organisation has continued within the care system to further the promotion and development of fostering. But we moved to become a registered adoption agency in 1972. The organisation was always reflecting and anticipating that children may be able to be reunited. It was rare in the early years, so some of the nurses went on to apprentice and thereby to adopt. But for many, and for the large majority of the children, that separation at 4 or 5 was a permanent one. But as modern psychological theory developed the understanding, then these bridges and the liberalisation of social attitudes meant that the foster carer connection may remain around and since the war. Coram was never an adoption agency involved in the placement of relinquished children. It was always fostering. And from 1972, and we've just celebrated our 50th birthday as an adoption agency, it has always been about the finding of a permanent loving home for children for whom adoption was a decision because they had been removed into care for their own protection and well-being. The woman who led, so the women who have played their part in this, just around the war, was Mary Isabel known as Delia, who studied social science at the LSE in the 1930s and came to Coram just after that 1948 period as its first professional children's officer of the modern children's services era, and was made CBE for her services. In 1974, Jeanne Kanyuk, also recognised with an honour for her service, became the head of the adoption service. And Jeanne was the head of adoption for 38 years before retiring, and was the pioneer of early placement for infants through the modern care system known as concurrent planning. She was also the pioneer of the finding of placements for HIV positive children and for the development of progressive practice in diverse placements. The first woman to chair our board was Dame Gillian Wagner, who wrote the biography of Thomas Coram in 2015. And the first woman to become chief executive was Dame Gillian Pugh, whose book, London's Forgotten Children, has recently been updated. And the key figures who are working today are characterized by longevity, exceptional levels of professional recognition and integrity. And I commend to you some of my colleagues, including Renika Jayaraja-Dent, who served for 14 years as Director of Operations and has just undertaken service as a member of the National Panel on Child Safeguarding. Bridget Robinson, MBE, who leads Coram Voice, having run many leaving care services, and Jan Forshaw, MBE, who has worked for 30 years to develop children's own skills and experience as through our personal, social, and health education development. So we all know that 100 years on from those first governors, and some 300 years on from Thomas Coram's campaign, that the role of women in the Foundling Hospital is one of the great untold stories of history. So thank you all for listening to our presentation. And I'm now going to ask our panelists to come onto the screen so that we can see them, and also just see whether there are questions that have been put forwards. And indeed, we have one already. I don't know, it's probably one for Carol Harris initially, which is a question which is, what was the thinking behind changing the child's name?
Right, well, it's a very good question, because this is something that goes throughout the history of the Foundling Hospital as an institution. The idea was very much from Thomas Coram's ideas about the Foundling Hospital. There was a fresh start for the mother who'd had a child outside of marriage and the social stigma around that in the 1700s, and a fresh start for the child as well. So the idea of giving them new names, rebaptizing them or baptizing them on entry was to do with that. And the original name the child had would be sealed up in the famous billet books, so that should the mother want to come and reclaim her child's birth mother at any point in the future, those details would then be revealed and opened up, but only if the mother did so. So yes, it was all about confidentiality of the mothers as well, a fresh start for both.
Yes, thank you, Carol. I mean, Kate wanted to come in. You've got another perspective there, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, well, just to add to what Carol said, I think as well, it's also about avoiding the stigma of illegitimacy, because Thomas Coram and Jonas Hanway, who also helped set it up, were very worried because illegitimacy had this huge stigma, and so they were hoping that a child would never find out that they were illegitimate, and if they had their name they could look up the parish register. And one thing that I think historians are really only starting to fully grapple with, for the 18th century anyway, there's more material kind of for more modern times, is the effect of this on a child's self-identity. And in the archives there are a number of petitions where groups of foundlings as adults have come together, and there's one particular one, and it's a massive, A1 parchment piece of paper that they've had done by a notary. And this, 10 or 15 foundlings have come together to petition the hospital formally to say it's cruel to hide our real identities from us. And they say things like, I could have siblings, I could have cousins, and I can never find them, because I think they're only, and correct me, Carol, if I'm wrong here, but I think they're only allowed to unseal the billet if the parent asks to reclaim them. It doesn't work the other way around.
No, it's extremely important to understand a number of things. One is that the identity of the child was not necessarily known. So there were also children who were literally just handed in by an agent or by someone who did not declare. So one of the great concerns was to treat all children equally, no matter, as it were, what that did to any individual child. And indeed, our former pupils, who are, in their 80s and indeed 90s now, do talk about the fact that there was no stigma for them in their group of kind of pseudo brothers and sisters, the community of children they were brought up with, because they were all the same and they all treated the same. So when I hear about the fact that 28% of children tell us who are in kinship foster caring that they are frightened to go to school because of fear of the bullying that they may experience, you can see that however harsh that might sound, there was actually a benevolent spirit at work. It's just extremely difficult to find the right balance. Secondly, the consequences for the mother of being found out in these circumstances were absolutely extreme. I mean, they were immediately cast out from their employment. These were illegitimate children. This was the only organization really to work with illegitimate children for 150 years. And there was no judgment, conveyed by Thomas Coram and the early governors against either the woman or the child, although he was accused of promoting lewd behavior. You take these children in, they're going to have more of them type of line, and he wasn't having any truck with that, but he had a very difficult line to tread because he wanted to give those mothers the opportunity to make their way in the world and potentially be able to return for their child, or at least not to die on the streets as a result. So the anonymity was a key promise to the women, and it was enshrined in effect in regulation and in laws, and therefore it was not overturned lightly. Indeed, it took a specific provision within legislation for the governors of the founding hospital to be able to overturn that guarantee of anonymity. So these are complex matters. Throughout history, and we continue to support our former pupils today, there is also the challenge, and it's experienced, of course, by children in the care system today. Questions of identity are absolutely central, but seeking to find does not necessarily result in a welcome. So there are also circumstances in which the birth record support was undertaken and former pupils supported to find their relatives, but they were rejected again. So there are so many complex issues in this. But that was the circumstance, and the situation really only changed in the post-war period, which I think is a function of the changes that led to the Children Act, the realization, perhaps on the back of the massive experience of evacuation of children and the alternative placement that happened, and liberalisation of social attitudes, that children should have entitlement to this and that the issues of stigma should be addressed. But I have to tell you that we're still working with young people in the care system today who tell us, for example, that the register at school will have the word lack written by their name, looked after child, or that the teacher will come in and say, James, come out now, your social worker is here. And that they still feel that they are living with that stigma. So, do we have other questions from anyone in the audience? I'm struggling to find. Yes, we do. We have Hilary, and she's asking about this, have parts 2 and 3 of the insight to the role of women in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Hilary, I hope some of what I've said is a kind of glimpse into that. I think what I might say in respect of your question is, shall we do another one in a couple of weeks' time or so, and perhaps follow up the story, because there's an awful lot of this history. And as you can see, it is the story of, in many ways, it began with Thomas Coram's petition and the 21 ladies of quality and distinction who made it actually possible for him to get his charter, all the way up today, and what one might call the continued movement of care. So do let me know if that would be welcome. She says, yes, definitely have another workshop. So guys, I think you might be game on for another time. There is a question that's come in from Patricia on who chose the child's new name, but I think Carol might be able to answer that, but also give us some further insight.
Right. Well, can I first of all say, because Kate won't mention it, but she's written a really good book, Illegitimacy, Family and Stigma in England, that covers 1660 to 1834. So have a look at that at Oxford University Press if you want to find out more generally. The names, well, at first, this is quite fun. When in the very early days, the Foundling Hospital governors would choose the new names for the children. And it was thought a good idea to give them the names of the governors, so the family name. So you'd get a child called, you know, sort of John Russell, after the Bedford family, and our first vice president was the 4th Duke of Bedford. And all that kind of stuff was going on. Of course, no one really thought what could possibly go wrong with this idea. And so eventually, in an environment, in a world where there was absolutely no proof of paternity other than, you know, whether people were willing to believe someone or not, in the vast majority of cases, of course, people would turn up and say, I am the long lost son or daughter. And yes, they quickly realized this was not a good idea. So as far as I'm aware, and I correct me, you know, if you know anything additional, Kate or Carol, or indeed anyone on the chat, it was down to the governors to choose the names for quite some time. And one of the things you often find is that the names of local streets pop up in the renaming. I know writers of fiction do this quite a lot with their fictional characters, because you're less at risk of accidentally making your villain into a real person, or at least you've got an argument if it turns out that you've misappropriated a name that turns out to be a real person who then gets very cross about it. So things like that, there were quite a few Thomas Corams early on, obviously. So some of the mentioning the history of the Foundling Hospital in terms of the rename, but some of them are just brilliant. I mean, they just come, I don't know where Salisbury Brereton came from, but that is a fantastic name. There are some amazing names for the children. People were getting more and more creative, I think.
I'm always a bit worried about what it must have been like to have been Julius Caesar, however.
Yes.
And that must have been a bit tricky. But you know, what Kate was talking about the sheer scale of the admissions and the numbers of children. And then, of course, there was in those earliest decades, indeed century, a huge number of infant deaths. I mean, it was a much better survival rate than in the general population, but there were a lot of names needed, and therefore, they did recycle. I always like to think, I mean, I hear what Carol is saying about the difficulties of paternity, but actually a kind of generosity of spirit again, which is that the gift of a name, if your name was a name that was associated with status, then what better thing to do than to give this foundling child, this illegitimate child who was going to face a life of stigma, a name that might help transport them through life. I like to think that maybe that was something to do with it. Kate, you wanted to come in.
Well, just on that note, actually, so quite a lot of girls were called Pamela Andrews, and Pamela was the best-selling novel of the mid-18th century, and it's subtitled Virtue Rewarded. So Pamela fights off seducers. And so by calling an illegitimate girl Pamela Andrews, you are giving her this, I mean, for a child, a horrible weight on themselves, but also this belief that they can be really good and that they can have this amazing life, because Pamela, she's a heroine, she does great things, and so like it's sort of this weird duality of a big psychological weight on a child, and perhaps I'm not sure the governor's really thought it through, but also this idea of their potential. They have potential, these children, and that they should go out into the world and do whatever they want.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of thinking behind the names. But on a kind of, from a historian's perspective, from a researcher's perspective, calling a child Pamela Andrews or Julius Caesar is actually great, because it means I can find them in censuses and marriage records. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is trace the foundlings, some of them at least, to work out if they moved back to the areas where their nurses were from, to work out if they had continuing contact with their nurses. So I'm looking at things like their marriage registers, and them having weird names is a gift. There's a lot of John Browns in the world, and they're very hard to find for historians, but Pamela Andrews is a lot easier.
Yes, I mean, it was very interesting that when there was a production of Coram Boy by Jamila Gavin, wonderful fiction, but based upon the archive, it was being performed at the Nottingham Playhouse. And I went up to do a talk to the cast, and of course discovered that within the cast there were two descendants of former pupils who had been apprenticed to that area, and the passage of names is such a fascinating element. So we have a hand raised by Brent. Caitlin, can you ask Brent for his question, because I can't see it, and we'd love to see him if he would like to ask that himself. Brent, would you like to come off mute and ask your question? That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, perhaps. Caitlin, perhaps you can assist us to find the way of accessing Brent's question, which we seem to be struggling with a little bit. Just let me see if I can find it. Nope, not sure what's happened to Brent, so we'll pass on. I'd like to ask Kate a question, because it is so interesting that the period of time that you're looking at, which is in this pre-era when adoption was not recognised, not legalised. What was the most sort of interesting or surprising thing that you found about that sense of permanence? I mean, children were, of course, not named after their foster carer, their nurse, because even if they wanted to take on the child, even if they were permitted, as it were, to do so within the rules, that was not a journey that was followed. Am I correct?
Yeah, so there's a lot of hoops that they have to jump through. So a nurse could request, so at first what you start getting is nurses refusing to give children up. That's kind of the first stage that happens kind of relatively quite soon after the Foundling Hospital starts operating. And basically the nurses start saying, can stop paying me. I don't need pay. Please allow me to keep the child. I'll keep the child. They use this phrase upon any terms. And you can really it's really poignant because you can kind of feel the desperation of someone that's looked after a child for 5 years and is basically saying, please, what do I do? Please don't take the child away. And in response to that, the governors come back with, well, the best we can possibly do is apprenticeship because there's no such thing as adoption. And so parental rights are inalienable under the law. And basically, legally, the foundling governors are their legal parents. So they cannot just jettison them to another. They can't transfer responsibility to another person. So apprenticeship is the closest you can get. And apprenticeship is also crucial because it gives you this thing called settlement. And if anybody's not familiar with 18th century poor relief welfare payments, which is a lot of people, you need settlement in order to be able to claim relief payments when you're older. So basically anybody who was born in a particular parish, if they fell on hard times, could claim money from that parish. But a foundling has no settlement. They are not in the community in that way. And so if they were just left with the foster mothers, say that foster parent died and that child was left destitute, needed to go into the workhouse, needed relief, they'd have no claim whatsoever. And so that apprenticeship it's really important legally. So you can see why they're picking it, but it's a sort of funny. It's funny to have a child
apprenticed at 6.
Yeah, and they're apprenticing them really young, and they're saying, we'll put them to school, we'll then get them apprenticed to someone else when they're like 15, like you would a biological child. And I suppose in terms of the most surprising thing was I was unprepared for how much and how articulate the foster parents would be about, I will do anything in order to keep this child. I was expecting, the odd request, but it's a lot.
Except that it's some. For most, it was a profession. Mm-hmm. It was a job. And of course, a vital source of income. And that has been the continuing guiding thing. So we still hear of children who are returned to care whilst the foster carer family goes on holiday. We still hear of children who are handed back because I can take another emergency placement. We still hear of and are still fighting on occasions when the local authority notifies a foster carer and a child that they're moving next Thursday because it's an out of borough placement. So all of these things are important to note. And of course, modern concepts of attachment were unknown at the time. In the earliest period, the most likely outcome of a child's first 5 years of life was death. With extraordinarily high, life was extremely fragile. And of course, the emotions of that, Kate has touched upon, where many of the women who would be acting as wet nurses may feel that fragility for their own children or have experienced that bereavement, no matter their class. Today, the vast majority of foster carers are as compassionate, as committed as ever, but still it is the minority result for them to remain in that family for the rest of their childhood and into their adult life. So with those last closing remarks and our enormous thanks to Kate and Carol, I would like to thank you all for joining us. We have our marching orders that we need to update the story and be back with you in a little while, and we will most certainly do that and take the liberty of contacting you all if we have your contact details. And Caitlin will bring up for you in a moment a slide on how you can make sure that you know what future Coram Society events there are, and also that we have a most interesting showcase this coming week with young people who were adopted from care and who are exploring what they describe as in between lines, the issues of a mixed identity. And we would love to see you, should any of you be near London and able to join them in person. The world's first and longest continuing children's charity is doing its first open mic night. So that's going to be a great change for us. But Caitlin, I trust that you will bring up the slides, and may I join you all in thanking Kate and Carol. And please do get hold of that wonderful book by Kate and the article in History Today. You just need to put that onto presentation view, Caitlin, and thank you all very, very much, and good evening.
Bye, everyone.